Well, welcome everyone to week 2, Sociology of Pop Culture. We've navigated the first week of the term. First week is kind of the real tricky part, just kind of getting set in the class, knowing what the expectations are, just knowing what the requirements are, the papers, all that kind of good stuff. So should be feeling pretty good that you're grounded. You know kind of what's going on week to week now. Now it's a matter of just having the time, the dedication to work through the readings and the write-ups and, fulfill the requirements of the course that way. I want to give you a little bit of a preview of the readings for this week, just to kind of put a perspective around the readings. As I mentioned last week, the first couple weeks of the term are really just kind of getting a foundation in a sociology of pop culture, what that looks like, or a sociology of culture. And then we'll kind of start moving into, starting week 3, some different areas. We'll start off with advertising on week 3 and week 4 and kind of explore that a little bit. The 3 readings for this week, the 2 of the readings are two parts of readings that they overlap, and that's good. Actually, I should say they all overlap because they're all about sort of theory and sort of ideas about sociology and its application to popular culture. But the Grazian articles are, let me sort of look at them. There's 2 of them. There's one on functionalism and one on conflict theory, or what's called the critical approach. Different words to talk about conflict theory. Conflict theory could be talked about as Marxism, a Marxist perspective, a critical theory perspective, or conflict theory. They're all the same thing. So these are 2 kind of ways of thinking about culture from the functionalist paradigm and the conflict theory paradigm. What I really encourage students to think about is that not one perspective is right and the other wrong. It's more about the application of the theory to whatever it is that we're looking at, and in some ways the depth of perspective you can offer with that theory, or the evidence that you can provide with applying that particular theory. So let me just describe both of those real briefly and then give you an example to kind of illustrate both theories. Functionalism, some main ideas is that functionalist perspective has a view that culture is a reflection of the values of the community itself. It's a consensus view, not an agreement. It's not that what we see in culture is a reflection of what everybody believes, what everybody agrees to. But functionalist has a sort of belief in this idea that things that are operating in culture, that are visible in culture, that are there in culture, are a reflection of the values that are necessary for the stability of society. They're the values that are there and the symbols that we see, what's being represented is a reflection of the needs, the desires, the wants, the wishes, the values, and the beliefs of the consensus of the community itself. Now that community could be a local community, regional community, national community, world community. I think you could draw the circles in different ways there. One thing, there's a lot of different applications. I'm not going to talk about all the applications of functionalism to popular culture. You'll be reading about quite a few of those. One's kind of interesting to me is this thing about the role that popular culture plays in mediating what our values and beliefs are. So let me kind of restate that we oftentimes in societies we're trying to develop and to identify, okay, what is it that we stand for? What do we represent? How much are we willing to tolerate people who go beyond sort of a particular boundary or particular idea of what is right and what is wrong? What Durkheim, a functionalist, talked about is sort of moral boundaries. That's important that we draw moral boundaries between right and wrong. All groups do this. All people throughout human communities, they draw moral boundaries of what's right and what is wrong. It's through pop culture sometimes that we mediate or we have larger discussions about what is right and what is wrong. And that's one of the functions of popular culture, is to help solidify, clarify, identify where we see right versus wrong. I'll give you an example. So last few years ago, San Francisco 49ers and Kaepernick and kneeling during an NFL game. And so this controversy around this, I think is a great classic example about how we understand race-related issues in the United States, the place of having those discussions, the forum. What are the conversations that people are having about kneeling? Are they supportive? Are they against? Are they against athletes taking a position on a particular social issue? Why is it? What are all those conversations that are going on? And those conversations are really conversations about race, conversations about identity, conversations about politics, conversations about so many different things that it's well beyond what's going on on the football field. And I think, to me, it's like a great example about how something that's operating in popular culture, it's through that vehicle of popular culture that we're having these larger discussions about important social events, and that we are, in our communities, trying to determine what is the best course of action, the right course of action, how do we address these issues, and it's through popular culture that we're being able to do that. So kind of in general, that's kind of the idea of functionalism, that whatever we see within culture is a reflection of the values that we have within culture, that culture operates in a way that provides a lot of benefit and value for establishing kind of a sense of identity, group, a sense of cohesion would be the hope. Doesn't always work that way, but that's kind of the general idea. And then conflict theory, or the Marxist perspective, has a different vantage point. Marxism talks about, or Marx talked about, this idea of historical materialism. And materialism, I mean, the main idea of materialism is we're looking at the economic conditions or political economic conditions of a particular society and its influence on what's going on within culture itself. So the privilege, or the vantage point, is always starting from the political economic structure of a system, and how that political economic structure starts to influence things that are going on within culture itself. I'll give you an example of looking at pharmaceutical advertisements for pharmaceuticals. At least as of a few years ago, there were only 2 countries in the industrialized world, and I imagine the world at large, that allowed for direct-to-consumer advertising for pharmaceuticals. So that's advertisements that we'd see in the popular press as well as on TV and other media platforms. There's only 2 countries that permit direct-to-consumer advertising for pharmaceuticals, and that's the United States, and then, strangely, oddly enough, I don't know why, but New Zealand, the other country. Most other countries see it as not something that's educating and informing and of a benefit to people within communities, but rather it's too much about promoting a product versus educating and informing. And there's a cost to that, both social and economic cost to governments and societies, of direct consumer advertising. Now, that we do that and other countries don't, I think it's a reflection of our values. We're a free market-based society. We have strong convictions in that. And Marx would take this sort of materialist perspective and say, it's our political economic, that structure piece that provides that allows for that to happen. And Marx would raise the question that, does direct consumer advertising benefit the community at large, or is it benefiting those in positions of power, those in the pharmaceutical industry, executives, and the industry itself over the community? Now, you can get into a lot of debate about that, I guess, but I think it raises a great question. It's about the influence of industries and influence of position basically over culture. What's available, what we see, what goes on within culture. The functionalist viewpoint is that it comes from a consensus, that whatever we see is a reflection of us working through things as a society. Marx has a perspective, or the conflict theory perspective, that what's in culture itself is a reflection of a lot of power relations, a lot of political economic relations, and it has to do with the economic structure and conditions that are present. So let's go back to Kaepernick and kneeling, when athletes were kneeling during the halftime show or during the pregame. And not the halftime show, pregame. So while there's a conflict going on, between there's a lot of debate, a lot of discussion, that doesn't make it conflict theory. That it's still, argue that's a very functionalist thing that's going on when we are debating in our communities about what's going on and what's the right response and all those kind of things about kneeling in the pregame show. I think what provides a better example in terms of conflict theory, a good example of conflict theory, would be looking at representation of Native Americans as mascots for athletic teams. I posted a video, so in week 2, if you open up the folder, you see one of the videos down there. It's from an organization that's advocating that moving away from Native American mascots and the reasons why. Sort of see that mascots they homogenize a group, they dehumanize a population, and it's a challenge, right? And it's this idea that culture has, the creation of culture isn't done in a way that humanizes all of us at the same time. That some groups are represented in ways that are devaluing, demeaning, stereotyping in ways that are very problematic. So conflict theory is going to look at, maybe an area of representation and how representation reinforces particular power relations between a dominant group and a group that's being dominated. Could also be conflict theories looking at the overall institution and structure of media and culture. We have very few media outlets that own, or organizations, companies, corporations that own most of the media outlets that we are exposed to. I think you'd be surprised about how, 5, 6, 7 corporations control 90% plus of media content in the United States. That raises a lot of powerful questions about, if we consolidate the number of media outlets to very few and owned by very few companies that are large, does that start to influence the content that we see in the media? And I'd say it'd be hard to argue that it did not. I think the question becomes one of, how does it shape what we see? What content do we see? And equally as important, what content do we not see when we have that kind of consolidation of the media? So that's kind of conflict theory. That's kind of functionalism. I got a few more minutes. I don't want to make this more than 15 minutes long. Let me talk about the Kellner article a little bit. So the Kellner article is one on cultural studies. I wanted you to read that for a couple reasons. One, it gives you exposure to an academic field called cultural studies. And cultural studies kind of borrows from a few different disciplines, or it integrates a few different disciplines, sociology being one of them. And I think it provides just sort of a good overview of what is cultural studies. It's a very unique area where it's the purpose and the idea of cultural studies is to examine culture, to examine, critique, and to challenge what's going on in terms of the production of culture itself. Because within culture, I think there was a recognition started in the going back to the Birmingham School or the Frankfurt School, then the Birmingham School. You read about both those. One of them in the Griswold article, you'll read about the Frankfurt School addressing issues of social control through media, basically through the media. And cultural studies arises out of that tradition, and it's really trying to get to examine that stuff in culture, because within culture, there's a lot of stuff that's going on that we're exposed to, and somehow, oftentimes, we're not critically aware of what's going on, or what we're being exposed to, how we're interpreting, internalizing, how that's shaping our worldview, and how that's reproducing particular economic and social conditions. And it's really a project, the Cultural Studies Project, a project of investigation to challenge and to maybe alter culture in ways that are more representative of our collective values and needs, and respectful of differences between groups. The one thing to take away from the Kellner article is that cultural studies and looking at culture there's the tripartite approach. I think is a very useful model to think about. There's 3 aspects of culture to look at. One of them is the production of culture. So looking at, for example, going back to the consolidation of media, it's like, okay, well, let's look at the institution of media. Let's look at the organization, the political economy of mass media. How is it operating? What's the structure? What's that macro level sort of piece? And then we can look at mass media through that lens of production, because that has an influence, for sure, in terms of content and availability, our exposure to it. So one part of the tripartite approach is looking at the production of culture itself. It's that particular part on structure, institution, the political economy of Hollywood, for example, or of the popular press, whatever it may be, it's looking at the production of it. Then there's the second part of it's looking at the reception, of audience reception. Okay, how is the audience interpreting what's going on? Different audiences, different demographics can interpret messages in different ways. So we could all be exposed to a particular advertisement, but depending on your age, your social class, your race, gender, sexual identity, all these different things may influence how we interpret and receive the message. So you kind of, you'll read about that a little bit in that Kellner article, that sometimes people read against the grain. There may be the intended kind of messages coming out of a particular product or a particular film or message or symbol, but audiences may interpret it in different ways. And sometimes they may reinterpret it against the grain and offer a different kind of interpretation of what the dominant sort of message was. So we have production of culture, then we have the sort of audience reception, and the third part is looking at the text itself, okay, looking at how to interpret the text and the meaning, and to do what's called a textual analysis. So if we look at an image of a Native American mascots, we look at or just a collection of them. What does that text mean? What's the origin of those symbols? What are those symbols themselves? Let's unpackage just looking at the text itself. The text has a lot of meaning in it. And starting next week and looking at advertisements, we'll read a few articles about semiotics, which is the study of signs, and that's really a study of the text, and you'll kind of read about that. And then finally, just 1 or 2 more minutes here, the Griswold article really combines functionalism, conflict theory, gives you kind of another framework to think about it. Talks about Max Weber and the Protestant work ethic and the spirit of capitalism, so a place of looking at where culture becomes really important. For Weber, he differed from Marx because Weber really privileged culture, said, culture and structure are operating together. Culture is an incredibly powerful driving force to understand economic, political, social structure. It's really about culture, and that's sort of where he is. All right, finally, there's a film this week. I hope you're really going to enjoy it. I thought it was fascinating. It's available on Canopy. So if you go to the COCC homepage, I gave you directions of how to access it. It's called Sneakerheads. It's looking at sneakers. I mean, a common everyday item, but looking at the meaning that's given to sneakers, the sneaker subculture, the movement and development of sneaker subculture, the infusion of how new technologies and how we shop have changed sort of the sneaker subculture. I don't know, it's fascinating sort of an examination of one cultural artifact. I mean, your shoe, right? That it's more than just footwear. And I think that's one of the beauties and one of the magical things about looking at things from a lens of popular culture is that there's the utility value of something like my phone, right? It's just a device to access information and to do what it needs to do. But man, there's so much more going on in terms of that if we want to look at that. Is it the Apple phone? Is it the Droid phone? What kind of meaning do we assign to those kind of things? What about all the things, it's like how we decorate our phones, establish our identity in those sort of way. This one's in an OtterBox, what's the difference between that and a different one? Is it really about the quality of the product, or is it about something else that we're buying into when we're consuming these kind of things? So it's the day-to-day life stuff. It's where we live. It's one of the coolest things about examining popular culture. It's the stuff in everyday life that's filled with so much meaning and perspective. And I think it's so empowering to be able to unpackage that and look at that more critically. And it empowers us to be more informed and more informed, both consumers as well as more informed citizens within the world in which we live. All right, with that, enough said. Have a great day, and I hope you're having a great week, and I look forward to reading your papers. I will make comments and get them back to you as soon as I can. All right, that's it for now. Bye-bye.